Jim Rutt, CIO, CISO, you have seen a thing or two in your illustrious career. Tell me what keeps you up at night these days.
It's a perennial question, right? So obviously, we're constantly worried about our attack surface here at Data. I mean, there's with new and emerging threats, most of them driven and powered by AI nowadays, as we all know. So we're constantly assessing that. We're assessing, the two major areas I think most CISOs are worried about, which are protecting our data properly, especially seeing all the breaches that keep coming to the mainstream media, as well as, basic data protection from privacy perspective, as those regulations keep increasing. And then, as we're starting to move into the new AI era here at Data, we're trying to make sure that we use it responsibly, efficiently, and safely. So there's a constant need to research these types of solutions, whether they be controls, whether it be new capabilities to help us enable AI at the foundation. So we get very busy.
Well, so I'm curious about the proliferation that's happening on both sides. The bad actors are getting more and more powerful tools, and now with AI, and eventually with quantum computing and all the nefarious ways you can take advantage of that horsepower. And on the other side, you've got the good guys trying to battle back or trying to protect things. Where does this go? I mean, do we end up with essentially a new paradigm for security? Do you think where basically there can be no security, and so there has to be a rethinking of what security looks like?
I think we've been asking that question for the past 20, 25 years since I've been in the business, as it were. I think just the principles remain the same. The techniques have changed. So, with quantum, the good news is whatever quantum attacks that are maybe out in the wild somewhere or maybe planned, at least we know that we've got some kind of standards thanks to NIST around controls for quantum cryptography. That's not going to be the be all end all, but at least we're sort of getting ahead of the game for a change rather than moving ahead with a lot of different technologies and not really thinking about how we do this safely. What we're baking in the controls rather than spraying them on afterwards, so to speak. So I think it's going to ebb and flow like it has, over the past couple of decades. But I think that it's an interesting dynamic with AI and quantum because they're both what I would term next generation technologies, next generation development tools. That it's going to be very interesting to see if one can help to protect against the other. Especially with AI, I think we're in the very, very early stages with AI. I think what's out there right now is not necessarily the be-all, end-all from a machine learning perspective. I mean, machine learning, as you all know, has been around for quite a while. I think that it's kind of resembles the dot-com era where we saw this big shift up with a bunch of different websites and things like that. In the late 90s, there was a big drop-off as there was a little bit of a hype cycle. And then everything settled down to where the technology really started to make game-changing moves, I would say 10 years after the web and all these things became public knowledge. We're going to see something very similar in AI, maybe a little compressed. I think probably in the next 6 to 8 years, you're really going to see true impacts to the way we work, the way we interact with each other, probably around that time. So it's good to know that we can see the protection schemes that we'll need to prepare for those times.
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember the PC revolution, and the internet and mobile devices and the cloud, and I've never seen anything like this. And we'll get into kind of where I think this is heading. But I think it's actually interesting, your work and the Dana Foundation in particular, because it's about neurosciences, and And in the end, I think that's the game changer here, is the idea that this is neural networks. Can you, before we get into all that, give us a little bit more about, what's happening with Dana Foundation and all the work there.
Sure, a little bit of backstory I think would be appropriate. So The Dana Foundation was founded in 1950. We're a sister organization of the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in the Boston area. We started off as an arts and education foundation. In 1992, we got new leadership on board, really for the focus of building, understanding, and a sharing kind of ecosystem around neuroscience. That's where our focus for neuroscience started. From 1992 onwards to about 2020, that was our main focus: neuroscience and imaging, the study of basically imaging of the brain and trying to figure out, how the brain works. I mean, it's still one of the biggest mysteries out there. We got new leadership in 2020, and now we've kind of shifted that focus towards neuroethics, which is very interesting because that is going to eventually evolve into AI ethics because of the parallels between neuroscience and machine learning, machine computing. We use the same terminology in both. Like you said, neural networks, key critical component in neuroscience, also in artificial intelligence and machine learning. So that's kind of the core space that I think those two interests, I think from the foundation perspective, and what we're seeing in terms of overall AI and ML evolution are going to converge.
Yeah, I mean, this is, again, I'm maybe over the top in how I think about this, but I can't help but see this when you do kind of break down, and I appreciate we don't truly understand how the brain works, but we sort of do. And what a neural network is effectively trying to replicate is that concept of human learning, of patterns, of prediction, of processing similar to how we believe the brain works. And obviously there's lots of room for doubt about everything, but that's the fascinating thing about AI right now, is I think there's a lot of doubt as to how it's going to evolve, because it's going to be training itself eventually.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's kind of a black box kind of effect there. And it's interesting. From a brain perspective, think about the trillions and trillions of neurons, cortexes, artifacts within the brain. We still don't have an idea how these all map together. From a high level perspective, we have a good idea.
I'm not sure we're getting all the potential we can out of them. I know yeah. I'm not.
Well, what's the old saying? 10% is the goal.
Yeah.
So you think about AI, to your point, once it gets to at least a guided self-learning situation, don't know how quickly that's going to happen on the road to AGI, which is another topic entirely.
Right.
It's going to be very, very interesting to see how we monitor these things, because we won't have, we'll only have like an obstructed view of all the artifacts involved.
So before we go down that rabbit hole, which is one of my favorite ones to go down, I'm curious about some of the other things you're working on. So I know data security is important, but how are you seeing, just kind of the whole work from home, work remote, hybrid, impacting the organization, and kind of how have you thought about your technology footprint and your network posture with regard to that kind of more edge atmosphere?
Sure. So not to say I was a genius or could see into the future, but we've kind of been planning for a hybrid workforce, as it were, probably a decade or so before COVID even came to the forefront. I had, in most of my previous organizations, I think we were a heavily on-premise type of infrastructure. It seemed to work out very well, but then I started to see cracks in that, especially here in the Northeast, where we went through a number of different natural disasters and other types of business interruption. where I started to think about what's really core to an organization. Do we want to be in the technology business through all these things? And I think that's what drove my move to move to a cloud computing centric kind of move, I would say about 12 or 13 years ago. Didn't want to manage a data center, wanted to be ready to, or had a larger vision that to work from wherever you wanted to and not have to worry about being dependent on a centralized compute stack or compute infrastructure stack. So during that move, I think we started to find a lot of great efficiencies, and we're, past just being able to work from home once a day, once a week, or periodically. I think we were well positioned almost accidentally when the pandemic hit and we all went remote. At this present time, we're about hybrid. So we're probably 2 or 3 days in the office a week, and the rest are, remote or otherwise. And adopting a cloud first architecture, I mean, now it's been out there, it's very well accepted. I think 10 or 11 years ago, there was a lot of questions, particularly about data governance, security, otherwise. And luckily, we've been able to make a lot of improvements, or the controls have been getting much, much better over the past 10 years, where it's a reality now. And I think even from a greenfield perspective, it's the best way to go.
Well, but it does come with its own set of risks, right? Again, I've been around a while, and I remember very specifically the resistance that there was to cloud computing by the old guard data center crowd that couldn't imagine putting their data outside of their, secure cold rooms, and now, to a certain degree, I think some of that old guard has moved beyond work, and some of the newer folks have moved up who have seen the value of software as a service and are very comfortable with cloud computing. But again, that comes with a certain amount of risk when you have employees who are in the end always going to represent a point of failure in terms of security. And you have all these devices where there's just kind of this demand to connect to networks with devices that may come in a variety of flavors and a variety of conscientious security precautions. How do you deal with that?
I would say, you always focus first on an end user's point of entry into the network, basic computer, on premise or outside, making sure that they have the basic controls needed to kind of focus on keeping them safe, and also making sure that they're not doing anything to exfiltrate sensitive data out, right? But now we've got kind of a complication there with data that's in software as a service. Obviously, it's a different environment to protect. I think just taking the same principles that we used in the past, making sure that, from an access control perspective, I would say being a little tighter on that, making sure that we can leverage whatever new controls that are available out there in the marketplace from an edge perspective, also from a SaaS perspective, to understand what kinds of data, get a better understanding of what kind of data is being used by our end users, and trying to educate them as well. I think education is unheralded. I think we just throw security awareness programs out to our user base, and that we call it a day, so to speak, when it comes to filling that risk. And I think it's one of the biggest risks. I know from my own personal perspective, the vast majority, and I'm talking about the past, not a data, but the vast majority of security incidents, shall we call, came from the inside, not from the outside, so to speak.
Yeah.
So I've always had that mindset to make sure that we do not only just throw a education program out to our user base, but make sure to get really intimate with our users and get them to understand what they're using, what is it to have a secure first mindset, and get them to understand the implications of using this type of data. And I think it helps. I mean, you're never going to have one push button way to eliminate all data risk or any kind of breach risk. It's just something that you need to keep, I think, continually seeding within the organization, using a combination of technical and user first controls, let's call it.
So how do you think about your security stack and ultimately your technology stack? I mean, these things, I mean, over time are in constant movement, evolution. Sometimes I think what we've seen at Solutions Review anyway is that they become this collection of point solutions that then require a more platform-based approach, and then something comes along and I mean, how have you seen it build out? I mean, are there things that you've kind of felt, have been tried and true, or are you how do you think about what's coming down the pipe and all the new things? I mean, how do you go through that sort of consideration cycle?
So short answer, I do like platform-based solutions wherever possible, using point solutions only in a very specific use case. And I think the best illustration of what you just described that's happening right now is happening around AI. I think I'm seeing a plethora of AI-specific security solutions, let's call them, whether they're models-based, whether they're data-based, or whether they're end-user focused. But when I think about AI, it's essentially data. So I would want something like that, I think, ultimately to be merged in with an overall enterprise data protection platform, or at least a solution that can handle both. So you're right. I think now what's happening is AI's come splashing onto the enterprise. Folks don't really have a great subject matter understanding of all the different pieces within it, like they do in a traditional relational database infrastructure. And now they're looking for a control to plug the gap, so to speak, at least until there's either a better understanding of how this data is moving in your environment, or more platform-minded solutions that can protect both your traditional legacy data environments and your newfangled LLMs, RAG environments, AI, what have you.
Yeah, so let's get into AI a little bit more. So take a step back. Solutions Review, our kind of father company to Inside Jam, once ChatGPT landed last year, we had to have a kind of an existential conversation internally about the value of what we'd been creating for content at Solutions Review. Words on screens all of a sudden seemed no longer defensible in terms of what can be created. And truth of the matter is that what ChatGPT represents as well now is a threat, a direct threat to what used to be considered the threshold for being an expert, which was you had to invest 10,000 hours of your time in order to be able to create content at the expert level that people could benefit from. But now, through a lot of data aggregation, scraping, aggregating, and ultimately processing, and now predicting, I could present myself, or quite frankly, my kids could present themselves as experts tomorrow without putting in any hours of time through written content that is being presented by ChatGPT. I mean, how do you think about that? I mean, what are we supposed to do with some of the content that we're out there reading? Do we believe that person that's presenting it as the author actually even understands what they presented, and could understand whether this was actually a correct answer provided to them by an AI chat bot?
Sure. So not only the words, the text, but also other media, right? I mean, that's another story entirely with
Yeah, no, that one's a different one. Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah. So from a word, from a perceived expertise perspective, I don't know. I think we're going to need some kind of model, something like a UL sticker, a good house. I remember the good housekeeping sticker,
Sure.
whatever, some kind of standard.
A verification.
A verification, but also verification of expertise, perhaps. Don't know how that's going to be doing it because you're talking about kind of a multimodal environment with different subject matter experts, different areas. Very, very difficult.
I think about this a lot because when we looked at it, we decided very specifically to begin to shift what we used to do from writing words on screens and putting posts that were, SEO optimized, as Google forced us all to do, to very specifically thinking we need to enable a human conversation. We need to have conversations like this between two humans in an extemporaneous way that allows the viewer to know that this is human thought being exchanged and not just predictive LLM output.
Well, I haven't seen any kind of tool yet that can definitively check a block of text out, shall we say, and tell you, yes, this was machine generated.
Agreed.
Or this was original thought. So what is that going to your point, it's going to come down to whatever trust we have between you and I as, knowing each other or what have you.
It begins to break down institutions, ultimately.
Yeah.
I mean, when your entire curriculum of homework can be done without you having to understand the subject matter, and there's no real way for middle-aged professors who've been in ivory towers forever to even hope to discern whether this was original work or and truth of the matter is that there's a case that can be made that what LLMs are delivering and neural networks are delivering is effectively original work, right? It's predictive, but it's original.
It's predictive off of existing works primarily. I think that the larger models, at least the ones that have been ethical in terms of being able to license or to, otherwise consume whatever base information, let's call it, that they can train inference off of. Yes. But yeah, it's going to be a very difficult situation. I think I can't think of a way to get around this. I think in a small scale controlled environment, you possibly could, but not in the general corpus of text out there on the internet. It's going to be very difficult.
Well, so what happens? I know there's been a new release of Claude 3.5 Sonnet, and by all accounts, it's coding better than a junior developer can code right now. And I'm curious about your opinion about what happens when it just is better, which won't be long. It's just going to be better than the junior developer. And what happens when that first layer, the kind of introductory job that we all get, where we're the chat GPT code monkey, whatever people refer to it as, where you're just kind of banging things out. If that just doesn't exist anymore, what's the path for people? I mean, have you given this any thought in terms of like the societal impact of what happens to people?
Yeah, very much so. I think I'm of the so it's funny. I just read an article today. I can't remember where it was, but they were talking about replacement of tasks rather than the job, right? Yeah. So you're right. Take a junior developer. They've got to build, X amount of code blocks or X amount of programs or whatever. Yes, I think these models are going to get better and better. As of the last version of Claude, I think it was pretty good. There still needs to be human review right now. I think in a number of years, call it 5 to 7 years, maybe it won't. Maybe it'll be that good. But I think the real point of worrying is when you've got AI being able to do more than just produce outputs that a job would, and be able to actually act like a human in that job. So a junior developer, they've got much, much more to do than just sitting down and grinding out code. There are other interactions in a typical organization that you just can't set an AI model to do. Obviously, there's a lot of orchestration, there's a lot of organization, and there's a lot of pieces that are just not, you don't just fire off code all day. There's other follow-ups and other things that you still need a human in the loop that can understand as subject matter expertise about that piece of code.
Well, but that's further up the ladder, and that's my larger point. Is I think what you're referring to in terms of the kind of stepped approach is this idea of agentic AI where there is a code creator agent, and then there's a code checker agent, and then there's a code runner agent that is then flagging. All the mistakes are being flagged through AI agents, and the loop continues and continues until it's effectively perfect. But that all happens instantly. It can do it so fast that you don't even realize how many times it's run the code and created new code or improved the code and corrected all the mistakes, and it's done effectively for free. I just don't know. And the person who would then determine where that block of code ends up going is further up the chain, who used to have that job.
Yeah,
now
right.
that job, I'm going to be curious to see how this kind of sorts itself out, because the old traditional ladders are going to start losing the bottom rungs, and I'm going to be curious to see how people and I don't think that's going to stop. By the way.
No,
rungs
I agree.
will be slowly burning their way to the top.
Operative word being slow. I think it will happen, but it's not going to happen. I think holistically, you're not going to see like a scythe, beheading all these folks. It's just not going to happen. There's just in a large organization, especially. You can put all these types of technologies in. There's just a lot of inertia working against it. I think culturally and or politically, it's not going to happen as quick as I think most folks happen, or as most pundits out there have been predicting. I think in small cases, yes, it's going to be more. I would say it would move a little bit quicker, but you're not going to go to the top Fortune 100 and kick out all their developers in one day, no matter if you've got the capabilities to do it.
It maybe not in one day, I agree, but I think there's a reason why all those developers are in India, because that was cheaper. I mean, in the end, there was a business decision made to offshore and outsource or whatever it was, and there are now 5-6 million developers in India, and that was a business decision, and this strikes me as a business decision in the final analysis. It's going to come down to dollars and cents, that we can get, for all intents and purposes, the same outputs for drastically less dollars. And
I also remember, sorry to cut in, but I remember 22, 23 years ago, I was probably 5 or 6 years into my career when everybody told me, you know what, everything's going to be outsourced, not just development, middle tier infrastructure support, all this stuff. Find something else to do. Well, I mean, there was a lot of offshoring. This is an interesting parallel that we're covering anyway.
Yeah.
There was a lot of offshoring, but there's also a lot of reshoring that came back for certain parts of that, because again, a wholesale decision just because it was cheaper. I liken it to just buying, there was a great book called Does IT Matter? Where they talked about you should just pay for IT like you do paper clips, lowest cost. It doesn't always work that way. I mean, we both know this. Through a number of different iterations of technologies over the past 10 years. Now, do I think AI could possibly fill that gap, that offshoring promise? I don't know. Could that mean more reshoring here of those technologies to automate out folks here. I'm still trying to telegraph that one.
Yeah, no, we were looking at new space for our offices the other day, and we went to a technology park, and that technology park was filled with floor after floor of empty server rooms. And the owners of the technology park hadn't kind of swallowed the reality yet that nobody's going to come back and fill those with servers. Those days are gone. The cloud is now the cloud, and people are not going to be putting anything in those large cold rooms. And it just struck me as I looked at it. It was literally a football field room of nothing but infrastructure. All the racks were gone, all the computers were gone. That's kind of I can't help but think that's the fate of the data analyst or the data or the software developer, that it's just inevitable that, you're not gonna buy your music in a store like I used to do, 10 songs at a time on a disc. You're just not gonna get you're not gonna need a person to be your data analyst, because in the end they can't really compete with this thing that will give you it'll give you the only answer that exists out of sheer horsepower. And
well,
that it's,
I think it may not be a pure data analyst position is named. Maybe it will be more of a pure business focused analyst that has data analytics tasks as part of their job description, which will ultimately be primarily AI driven or automated analytics. Is, how do we know this is going to happen? But I can tell you right now, I see a tremendous amount of startups in all these different areas that we've covered. And there are still multiple rounds of these things that have AI as part of what they offer, but are not fully automated yet. So that tells me if there's demand for this types of technology, we still haven't gotten to the point where we're ready to fully abstract the human out of those tasks.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I think as you know, because you've got the perspective of kind of that longer view, it will take time. I remember, I think it was Siebel that we were using back in the day, and then Salesforce.com came along, and we all thought, well, and it wasn't long before Siebel was, just not around anymore. And there was this kind of revelation of what, software as a service will be like. And it's incredibly, there will be, well, I mean, there will be a sales call at some point in the future that you will receive by someone, and they will show you something that will, it will be hard to not say yes, because it's just so obviously the right decision from a business perspective.
Yeah, especially you have the perspective. I think I agree with that question. And yes, I've done that in the past as well. Especially at the outset of our cloud compute transformation, as it were. Saw things that I knew were going to be the future, so we jumped on them. Yes. The question is, this next realm, we're taking humans almost completely out of, or the posit here is humans are going to be more or less out of the loop. Is this technology ready to handle all the things from start to finish, not just the individual automated tasks? I haven't seen that yet. I haven't seen a path to that yet.
So let's talk about your path, because I'm curious to get your perspective on. So when I think about AI, I don't worry about myself. Yeah. Like I said, I saw the PC and the internet and mobile devices and everything, and I adapted and kind of moved through it all. And But I do worry about my kids because AI over the next 25 or 35 years, well, that's a whole different thing. And it's not going to affect me, but it's definitely going to affect them. And I'm curious about your path. Do you remember how you got into technology? Do you remember your path?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I didn't study computer science or computer engineering in college. I actually was in marketing.
Yep.
And I think that the thing that really triggered, my entry in was kind of accidental. I was looking for tools as a marketer to help me gather data, for a couple of different campaigns. And I started learning about the internet, and this is, I would say 30 years ago. And thinking to myself, wow, I wonder if you could build a career out of that. And that's kind of how I started. I started decision support and then went to infrastructure, did a little analyst work, kind of in between, got into security as I moved along over the preceding 10 or 11 years. But yeah, I think it was an aha moment in the mid 90s that said, listen, this is fantastic technology. I think this is going to change the way we do business, which was very analog at that point. And back then I really thought, it's interesting in the context of this conversation. I thought things would change a lot quicker. We would all be buying and selling and journalists would be, completely unnecessary. And what is that, 25 years ago? And, we're getting there, but we're not, it didn't exactly match what I thought, but I think it has totally obviously changed, my career personally. I mean, it's been amazing. And look at all the efficiencies and wonderful things it's brought to our lives to present.
Well, so what advice do you offer to somebody who's just starting to, wrap up their education and they're going to join the workforce? I mean, are there certain traits that you would, as an employer, look for? I mean, what would you suggest somebody think about, not necessarily to study, but in terms of behavior, in terms of kind of habits and so forth?
Yeah, the number one thing that I look for is the willingness and readiness to be able to adopt and constantly evolve using new technologies in general. I think we're at a point now where things are changing almost week to week. As difficult as it is for somebody like myself to keep up with all this, I think it's going to be an absolute necessity moving forward, because that's going to give you, I think, a critical edge in your own career to adding whatever value that separates you from the pack, so to speak. That's assuming you don't go directly into a field like, data engineering or robotics or something that will at least give you a step up there, or maybe a career that's parallel to tech that is less likely to be, I would say, pushed to the side by AI, like in the medical field or something more hands-on. I think it's the willingness, the ability to learn, the willingness to change rapidly, much more rapidly than, we've been expected to in the past 20 years. I think those are going to be key traits.
One of the things I always consider is conscientiousness, the kind of willingness to go above and beyond as you kind of begin your career, where you say yes to pretty much everything.
I think you're going to need to do that, I think, a lot further in your career and take less for granted. I think that's
and recognizing kind of when things are when it's time to pivot. I do remember I started out in politics for the first 10 years of my career, and in the course of I worked for the state of Massachusetts for the governor, actually on a job training program that was designed to blow up the unemployment offices and create these career centers that were going to be much more entrepreneurial. And in the course of doing that, we were introduced. This was 1995. We were introduced to the internet. It was like we were by our consultants who said, "Well, this thing is called the internet, and this thing is what you really want to use to build a job bank and a talent bank." And I remember almost instantly after kind of seeing the kind of presentation of what a job bank and a talent bank would look like on the internet, in computer, at terminals, in offices, that I needed to get out of government and get. I taught myself HTML and went off on my merry way, because it was pretty obvious that this was going to be something completely different. And it turned out, you're right. It hasn't been, but that was, I don't know, what is that now? 30 years ago?
30 years ago. Well, slightly off topic, but I have been hearing that applications to trade schools have risen recently. And I wonder if that's a knee-jerk reaction to folks understanding that maybe some of these career paths like marketing or some of these other things that are definitely in the crosshairs of AI adoption. I think
it's the greatest irony of all is that the people who make their living in front of a screen and have, in many ways, I think, probably looked down their nose at the folks who make their living with their hands, are the ones that are going to be the most immediately affected. And the person who fixes your transmission or comes over on a Saturday night to service your boiler, they're going to be safe and sound from anything bad that's going to happen in the next 10 years.
I wouldn't say so much safe and sound. I mean, you always have the risk.
They might not have any customers.
Yeah. Well, even if they do, I mean, then you're in that physical paradigm. If you break an arm or break a leg, or how are you going to be able to do that? But your point is absolutely just perfect, 100%, because I never would have been able to telegraph this 25 to 30 years ago when I got into this crazy business.
Well, and I guess that's the benefit of for our generation, is that we're not going to have to deal with what's coming. That we're for the most part going to get the benefit. And then I'd like to think that maybe in my old age I'll have something to talk to that will talk back to me in a polite and friendly way that I can share the day
operative
with.
Word meaning operative word friendly.
Well, but yeah, I think it's going to be a pretty amazing time. So let's talk about what we would suggest for that younger generation as they, what are some of the final pieces of advice you might offer up to folks as they're moving through life? Specifically, do you remember maybe some of the conscious decisions you made along the way that as you were making them, you thought, yeah, I could go in two different directions here, but I'm going to do this one very specifically? I know you mentioned the moving out of marketing, but
yeah.
But I mean, have there been jobs that you've taken in the past where and what kind of thinking did you put around those decisions?
Well, I wouldn't say I telegraphed this perfectly, but I would say my movement, once I got into tech, I was in a number of, as I said, impact positions. My first management position was actually in healthcare in 2001. I think at that point, the fork in the road kind of came up and said, I could continue on doing some infrastructure management, or it seems like this security path could be very, very interesting. So at that point, I wouldn't say I flipped completely over to security overnight, but I made sure that every role that I took after that date had some level of security, responsibility, accountability, what have you. And I think generally that has been, I would say, a pretty solid arc. And we're talking 25 years. And I think that will continue, because unless, there's some major breakthrough that allows us to be completely 100% secure or sure enough of our defense controls, I think security is going to still be a major concern, throughout this new AI era as well. I don't see any way necessarily out of it. So I think it's a solid path for anybody looking to at least get into some area of technology without so much the risks of being, I would say like a junior developer, like you said, or some other role that, yes, in 7 to 10 years could be impacted.
That was an interesting decision because, I mean, computer networks at that point were still relatively new, business networks anyway, and a lot of thought was just getting the things to work, let alone securing them. Just getting them to work at all.
we were running our own email. I mean, stuff that I would never ever do again. We had our own email infrastructure. I mean, who would want to do that, willingly anymore? It's crazy.
I don't think people remember. Certainly, they shouldn't have to remember some of the pains that smart folks on the IT side were trying to sort through just to get things to work. And that was when everybody was coming into the office and plugging an Ethernet cable directly into the wall.
I mean, that was the least of it.
Yeah. So you mentioned NIST earlier, the idea of having NIST standards for security, or at least around encryption. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on kind of where government needs to be with regard to helping set a standard for organizations and protecting organizations from some of this more nefarious behavior.
Well, I think a lot of the things I've been seeing from the government, specific to AI, for instance, I think it's at least the most forward thinking I've seen in a long, long time. I mean, the biggest example of them really dropping the ball has been security in general, because they're just starting, in my mind, to really get serious about it when they should have got serious about it 20 years ago. You would have heard a deafening silence 20 years ago from the government about that. So I think they're making the right moves now. They're educating the public, which is desperately needed in the case of both cyber and AI. And I think NIST, has done a very good job at least publishing forward-looking standards. They're not necessarily a good fit for every organization size-wise, but at least there's something pretty solid with great research, and they're using really some of the best resources that we have out there to define how you should be thinking about all these different areas. And I think, especially when it comes to risk and certain areas like that, where you're not always thinking about every angle, I think they do a very, very good job. Now, it's not the easiest read I've ever had in my entire life. And again, it may not be appropriate, but it's certainly helpful.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question that there needs to be that public-private cooperation and really a kind of a forward-thinking. I think it was a retired Army general was just named to the board of OpenAI.
Yes. Well, NSA. I thought he was with the NSA.
He was with the NSA, yeah. And I don't think that's by coincidence. I think that was probably a nomination that was recommended enthusiastically for OpenAI to consider.
Sure. Well, there wasn't a lot of pushback. Let's put it that way.
Well, I think you have to recognize that this is going to be a matter of nation state security as much as it is a matter of corporate security eventually.
Agreed. I think it's certainly great to have that, I would say, viewpoint, especially from somebody that, again, the NSA is just a massive behemoth of contacts, information about cyber and AI. And so it's great to have that insight from them. So it certainly helped. Whether or not it's ultimately beneficial, the results are beneficial for us, we'll see. But at least you've got the right people from a subject matter expertise.
Yeah, no, I think there's probably a very strong, after seeing kind of the last year, there was probably a very strong need for folks on the government side to see exactly what was going on. Although I'm sure the NSA can probably see exactly what's going on in deep clarity.
Yeah. If Snowden was right.
Right. Well, This has been great, Jim. I appreciate the time. It's always a pleasure to talk to somebody who has seen a thing or two and has the perspective that you have. Anything you're looking forward to in the next coming year or the rest of the year?
So again, we're focused on what we plan to do around our own models within AI. Still sketching it out. We haven't really gotten a full, what I would call holistic strategy around it, but many of the items that we spoke about on this talk time, we are certainly considering. And I think more from the ethical perspective. I think we want to make sure that whatever we use internally or whatever we promulgate to our partners or anybody out there, that it's the most thoughtful, responsible, and effective things that we can bring. So we're excited.
Well, so are we. And again, we appreciate the time today. Jim Rutt, thank you very much. Best of luck for the rest of the year, and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yes, thank you for having me. It's been wonderful.
Solutions Review is inviting you to join InsightJam.com. What started a few years ago as a social media event to celebrate enterprise technology has now grown into an always-on tech community with live events, discussions, videos, vendor showcases, and industry resources. Our vetted roster of experts, thought leaders, and analysts are sharing tips and tricks daily. So if you're interested in getting involved, join the long list of companies and brands who have already participated by visiting InsightJam.com today. Now back to the show.